There are television shows, and then there are cultural landmarks. MASH was never just a show. For 11 seasons, from 1972 to 1983, it held a mirror up to American society and dared viewers to look at what war really costs, not in territory or treasure, but in human beings. It made people laugh and then, before they had time to recover, made them weep. It was irreverent and tender, absurd and devastatingly honest. And it was populated by some of the most memorable characters ever to grace a television screen. But here's something that often gets overlooked when people talk about MASH. The cast was never static. Over the course of its run, beloved actors came and went, each departure leaving a mark on the show's fabric and on the hearts of viewers who had grown deeply attached. Some left quietly, some dramatically, some with proper send-offs, and others with nothing more than an off-screen explanation. Each exit had its own story, personal, professional, creative, or emotional, and those stories are just as compelling as anything that ever happened inside the fictional 4077 TH today. We are going to explore those stories. We are going to look beyond the characters and into the lives of the real people who played them. What drove them away from one of the most successful shows in television history? What happened to them afterward? And what does their absence tell us about the show they left behind? Let us find out. Before we get into the departures, it helps to understand just what kind of phenomenon MASH was and how it came to be. The story begins not on a soundstage in Los Angeles, but on the battlefields of Korea and later in the imagination of a surgeon who survived them. Dr. H. Richard Hornbauger, writing under the pen name Richard Hooker, published his novel MASH, a novel about 3 Army doctors in 1968. Drawing on his own experiences as a mobile Army surgical hospital doctor during the Korean War, Hornbauger blended dark humor with the grim realities of combat medicine. The result was a book that felt utterly unlike anything else on shelves at the time. Funny in a way that hurt, honest in a way that lingered. Hollywood took notice. In 1970, director Robert Altman adapted the novel into a film that became one of the defining cinematic works of its era. Starring Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould, the film was anarchic, anti-authoritarian, and bracingly funny. It resonated deeply with audiences living through the Vietnam War, even though it was technically set during Korea. The film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, earned an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay, and made the idea of a surgical unit comedy feel not just viable but essential. 2 years later, producers Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds brought that idea to CBS, and on September 17, 1972, the television version of MASH made its debut. Alan Alda stepped into the role of Hawkeye Pierce, the wisecracking, morally conflicted surgeon who would become the emotional soul of the series. The early seasons retained the film's irreverence, but added something the film could not sustain over 2 hours: depth. Characters evolved. Relationships developed. Storylines grew more complex and more daring with every passing season. That IT was not an overnight success. The first season actually struggled in the ratings, and CBS reportedly considered canceling it before making the decision to move it to Saturday nights. That move changed everything. Ratings soared, and MASH settled into its long, remarkable run as one of the most watched and most discussed programs on American television. At its peak, the show was not merely entertaining viewers, it was shaping them, challenging them, and occasionally breaking there. And yet, even as MASH grew into a legend, it was constantly changing. The cast at heart in ways they had never expected from a comedy viewers knew and loved was never the same from one chapter to the next. Ask any longtime MASH devotee about the moment that fundamentally changed their relationship with the show, and most will point to the final moments of the Season 3 finale, an episode called Abyssinia, Henry. The scene is deceptively quiet. Radar walks into the operating room, removes his hat, and delivers news that had no business appearing in what audiences had always assumed was a comedy. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake's plane had been shot down over the Sea of Japan, and there were no survivors. The silence that followed in living rooms across America was profound. People sat with what they had just been told and struggled to process it. Because Henry Blake was not supposed to die. He was a bumbling, warm-hearted commanding officer of the 4077th, played with abundant charm and humanity by McLean Stevenson. He was comic relief. He was safe. And then, without warning, he was gone. To understand why McLean left and why his character met such an extraordinary end, you have to understand the particular frustration that was building inside him throughout those early seasons. McLean Stevenson was a genuinely talented performer who had arrived at MASH with real ambitions. He was funny, instinctively likable, and capable of carrying a scene with apparent ease. But as the show evolved, a pattern began emerging that troubled him deeply. MASH had started as something close to a true ensemble. The early episodes balanced their characters with reasonable fairness, giving Hawkeye, Trapper, Henry, Radar, and the others roughly comparable room to breathe. But as Alan Alda deepened his involvement with the show, eventually taking on writing and directing responsibilities in addition to acting, the gravitational center of the series began shifting unmistakably in Hawkeye's direction. Alda's character became the moral compass, the narrative anchor, the figure through whose eyes the audience was increasingly invited to experience the war. McLean found himself orbiting that center rather than sharing it. He was playing a supporting role in a show where he had assumed he would be a co-lead, and that reality chafed. He was not without self-awareness on the matter, but he also genuinely believed he had more to offer than the role was allowing him to give. He had dreams of becoming a headline act, of fronting his own vehicle, of being the name above the title rather than somewhere further down the credits. So he made a decision that surprised the production team. He would not be returning for season 4. He was leaving MASH to pursue his own path. The producers, Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds, took that news and did something bold with it. Rather than write Henry Blake off with a kind of gentle, tidy exit that sitcoms traditionally favored, a transfer here, a promotion there, they decided to honor what MASH was actually about. It was a show about war, and war does not always deliver happy endings. Henry Blake's death was not written as a shock tactic or stunt. It was written as a statement of intent. This show takes its subject seriously, even when it is making you laugh. The episode itself was constructed as a long, tender goodbye. Henry receives his discharge papers. The camp throws him a party. There are hugs and tears and laughter. For nearly the entire runtime, it plays like a proper, warm farewell. And then the final scene arrives and dismantles everything. The writing team kept the ending secret from most of the cast, so the reactions captured on film were largely genuine. Only Gary Burghoff, who played Radar and had to deliver the news, was told in advance so he could prepare himself emotionally. The audience response was extraordinary. CBS received enormous volumes of mail in the days following the broadcast, a mix of praise for the show's audacity and outrage from viewers who felt blindsided. But the decision stood, and it cemented MASH's reputation as a show willing to take real risks in the name of authenticity. As for McLean, the path he had chosen proved far rockier than he had anticipated. The NBC deal he signed came with genuine excitement behind it, but the projects that followed, including the McLean Stevenson show and later Hello, Larry, failed to connect with audiences and were cancelled with little ceremony. In retrospect, McLean would come to view his departure from MASH with considerable regret, describing it in interviews as a decision made in the heat of ambition without fully appreciating what he was walking away from. The show he left was a once-in-a-generation achievement. The career he built in its wake, though not without its moments, never reached those heights again. He passed away in 1996 at the age of 68, remembered fondly by his former castmates and by generations of fans for whom Henry Blake's death remained one of the most unexpectedly moving moments they had ever encountered on television. If McLean Stevenson's exit was dramatic and emotionally resonant, Wayne Rogers' departure from MASH was something else entirely, abrupt, legally peculiar, and quietly fascinating in what it reveals about how differently people can respond to the same set of frustrations. Wayne Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, Hawkeye's closest friend and partner in mischief. Together, Alda and Rogers embodied a specific kind of camaraderie, the kind forged in impossible circumstances, held together by shared humor and mutual respect. Their chemistry was real and palpable, and audiences responded to it with genuine warmth. Trapper was fast-talking, warm, playful, and reliably present whenever Hawkeye needed either a co-conspirator or a shoulder to lean on. But behind the chemistry, tensions were quietly developing. Wayne had come to MASH with an understanding, or at least an expectation, that the show would function as a genuine ensemble, that each of its core characters would receive roughly equal creative attention and narrative investment. As the season progressed, it became clear that this was not what was happening. Hawkeye was evolving, deepening, being given increasingly complex emotional material to wrestle with. Trapper, meanwhile, was remaining largely static, a sidekick, a reactor, a character defined primarily by his relationship to Hawkeye rather than by his own interior life. Wayne was not a man inclined toward public complaints or dramatic gestures. He processed his frustrations quietly and arrived at a conclusion with minimal fanfare. He would not be returning. He informed production that he was done. The producers reportedly threatened legal action, and then the situation took a genuinely unusual turn. It emerged that Wayne had never formally signed his contract. He had been working, essentially, on the strength of a handshake agreement, which meant that the legal leverage the producers believed they had simply did not exist. He walked away without a farewell episode, without a party, without Radar delivering heartbreaking news in an operating room. He simply disappeared from the story, and when season 4 began, the show acknowledged his absence with a brief, slightly awkward explanation that Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye was on leave. The audience had lost Henry Blake and now Trapper John in the span of a single off-season, and the sense of disorientation was considerable that in Trapper's place came B.J. Honeycutt, played by Mike Farrell, a character who was warmer, more introspective, less inclined toward the antic rebelliousness that had defined Trapper. The dynamic of the show shifted perceptibly. The buddy comedy energy of the early seasons softened into something more emotionally complex and, many would argue, ultimately more rewarding. Wayne, for his part, did not spiral into regret or career disappointment the way McLean had. He was a deeply intelligent man with a wide range of interests and capabilities. He had studied history at Princeton, and in the years following his time on MASH, he built a genuinely successful second career as a financial investor and analyst. By the 1990s, he was a recognizable figure in financial media, appearing regularly as a commentator and panelist. He made money, lived well, and seemed largely at peace with the choice he had made. Alan Alda, who had been his friend and colleague through the early seasons, spoke warmly of him after his passing in 2015 at the age of 82, describing him as one of the smartest people he had ever had the pleasure of knowing. There was no bitterness in those words, no complicated history to navigate around. Wayne Rogers made a decision, lived with it gracefully, and built a life of which he appeared genuinely proud. That of all the departures from MASH, Gary Burghoff may be the one that carries the most emotional complexity, not because of any dramatic behind-the-scenes conflict, but because of what it reveals about the genuine human cost of sustaining performance over years of grinding work. Gary played Radar Riley, and he was, in many ways, the soul of the early show. Radar was childlike in his innocence, uncanny in his intuition, and deeply tender beneath his awkward exterior. He carried a teddy bear into a war zone, and somehow made that feel entirely right. He was the one character who seemed genuinely bewildered by the violence and absurdity surrounding him, and that bewilderment made him the audience's most direct emotional proxy. When Radar was upset, viewers felt it in a way that was different from how they felt Hawkeye's anger or Henry's confusion. What made Gary's portrayal all the more remarkable was that he was the only cast member to carry his role over from the original 1970 film, where a somewhat different version of Radar had appeared. Gary had taken that foundation and rebuilt the character entirely, stripping away the film version's seedier edges and replacing them with something genuinely vulnerable and endearing. It was a performance built on extraordinary emotional generosity. But emotional generosity has a cost, and over the years, the bill came due. By the latter seasons of MASH, Gary was struggling in ways that he was not fully equipped to talk about publicly at the time. He dealt with significant anxiety and depression, conditions that were considerably less openly discussed in the 1970s than they are today, and the relentless production schedule of a network television drama compounded those struggles considerably. He was also deeply conflicted about the time the show required him to spend away from his family, including a young daughter whose early years he felt he was missing in ways he would never fully recover. There were also practical disputes about his working conditions. He sought better compensation, greater scheduling flexibility, and a reduced number of appearances per season that would allow him to be present in his personal life in ways the existing arrangement made difficult. The production team, understanding how central Radar was to the show's identity, worked to accommodate him where they could. But there is a limit to what accommodation can achieve when someone is simply exhausted to their core, and Gary had reached that limit. He left during season 8, and the show honored his departure with a genuine care that reflected how much he was valued. The 2-part farewell episode, titled Goodbye, Radar, is among the most quietly devastating pieces of television MASH ever produced. In it, Radar struggles with the realization that the camp no longer needs him quite the way it once did, that his role has shifted, and that perhaps it is time to go home. The final image, Radar walking away, his silhouette receding against Korean landscape, his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk, communicates everything the writers could not find word to say. After MASH, Gary stepped away from the spotlight significantly. A brief attempt at a spin-off project did not succeed, and he seemed to make peace with that fairly readily. He turned his energy toward painting, wildlife conservation, and a series of inventions for which he held multiple patents. He found, it seems, that the natural world offered him something the entertainment industry never quite could: genuine quiet, genuine peace. There's a particular kind of professional courage involved in walking away from something successful because you have recognized, with clear-eyed honesty, that you have taken it as far as it can go. That is the story of Larry Linville, and it deserves to be told with the respect it is due. Larry played Major Frank Burns for 5 seasons, and he played him brilliantly. Frank was petty, self-righteous, chronically insecure, and reliably hypocritical. A man who preached regulations he bent for himself, who resented the doctors around him for abilities he could not match, and whose secret affair with Major Houlihan added an element of absurd soap opera to his already considerable catalogue of failings. He was, in the language of television, the perfect villain audiences love to hate. Every sitcom needs someone to throw things at, metaphorically speaking, and Frank Burns served that function with tireless efficiency. But Larry Linville was an actor with considerably more range than Frank Burns required him to demonstrate. And as the show grew more sophisticated around him, the gap between Frank's one-dimensional villainy and the more nuanced characterizations surrounding him grew increasingly apparent. While Hawkeye grappled with moral complexity, while BJ wrestled with homesickness and the slow erosion of his ideals, while even Margaret Houlihan underwent genuine transformation, Frank Burns remained essentially unchanged. His insecurities did not deepen. His prejudices were not examined. He was a device, and a useful one, but a device nonetheless. Larry recognized this. And rather than wait for the character to be written out or for his frustration to curdle into resentment, he made a proactive decision at the end of season 5. He would not be returning. In various interviews, he articulated this clearly, explaining that he felt he had done everything with Frank Burns that the character allowed. He was not bitter. He was not pushed out. He simply understood that staying would mean repeating himself indefinitely. His departure created a creative opening that the show's writers stepped through with genuine inspiration. The introduction of Major Charles Emerson Winchester III, played by David Ogden Stiers, transformed the nature of antagonism within the show entirely. Where Frank had been blunt and buffoonish, Winchester was cultivated and formidable. Where Frank had invited contempt, Winchester invited genuine complexity. The shift elevated the entire series. Larry went on to work steadily in television and film in the years following MASH, but he never again found a role that captured public imagination quite the way Frank Burns had. He passed away in 2000, remembered by colleagues as a generous performer and by fans as a man who made 4 to 9 million Americans simultaneously despise and look forward to seeing a fictional Army major every week, which, when you think about it, is a remarkable achievement. David Ogden Stiers arrived on MASH as a replacement and departed as an original, which is perhaps the finest tribute that can be paid to the completeness of what he created with Charles Emerson Winchester III. Winchester was everything Frank Burns was not. He was educated, articulate, musically accomplished, and possessed of a genuine expertise that earned him grudging respect even from those he most irritated. He was snobbish, certainly, and his class consciousness was a constant source of friction with the more democratic sensibilities of Hawkeye and BJ. But he was never cruel in the way Frank had been. He was proud rather than petty, and that distinction made all the difference. Over time, the show revealed the person beneath the posturing, a man who cared about his patients even when he pretended not to, who felt the weight of the war even as he refused to let it show, who had chosen arrogance as a defensive posture against a world that had exposed him to suffering he had never anticipated. David stayed with MASH until the very end, appearing in the series finale that drew one of the largest audiences in television history. His final scene, sitting with Chinese prisoners of war and sharing with them his love of Mozart, is frequently cited as one of the most beautiful and quietly moving moments the show ever produced. It was a perfect conclusion to a perfectly realized character. Unlike several of his colleagues, David chose not to participate in the Aftermath spin-off, explaining simply that Winchester had completed his journey. There was nothing more to say, and David was not interested in diluting what had already been said. In 2009, David publicly discussed his sexuality, explaining in an interview that he was gay and that he had chosen, over the course of his career, to keep that aspect of his life private out of practical concern about how it might affect his professional opportunities. It was a candid and dignified statement from a man who had always conducted himself with considerable personal integrity. He passed away in 2018, at 75, leaving behind a body of work that extended well beyond MASH but that found its richest expression there. The story of MASH is largely, though not exclusively, a story of men. But no account of the show's human texture would be complete without a serious examination of what Loretta Swit accomplished over 11 seasons as Major Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan. When MASH began, Margaret was essentially a caricature. Her nickname, borrowed from the original film, told you everything the writers initially intended for her. She was a punchline, a foil, a figure of comic ridicule whose rigid adherence to military protocol and an ill-conceived affair with Frank Burns existed primarily to give Hawkeye and Trapper someone to skewer. She was not a person so much as a device. Loretta Swit had other ideas. Over the course of 11 seasons, through a combination of her own insistence and the gradual evolution of the show's writers, she transformed Margaret into one of the most fully realized characters in the series. She fought, through conversations with producers and writers, to have Margaret treated as a competent professional rather than a figure of mockery. She pushed for storylines that revealed the character's vulnerabilities without reducing her to them, that showed her strength without making her a stereotype of the stern military woman. She wanted Margaret to be, as she put it, a woman of substance, and she achieved that. Season by patient season. By the time MASH concluded, Margaret Houlihan was unrecognizable from the woman who had appeared in the pilot. She had been through a marriage that failed, friendships that deepened, moments of genuine heroism, and a slow, hard-won transformation from the show's antagonist into one of its moral pillars. Loretta stayed for all 11 seasons, one of only a handful of cast members to appear in both the first episode and the last, and her persistence was itself a kind of argument about what women could be on television and about what a character could become when someone refused to accept the limitations that had been written for her. She asked for more, and she got it. And MASH was enormously better for it, taken together. The exits from MASH form a portrait that is more interesting and more human than any simple narrative of conflict or ambition can capture. McLean Stevenson left chasing a dream and discovered that what he had was irreplaceable. Wayne Rogers left on his own quiet terms and built a life of considerable success by different means. Gary Burghoff left because the work had cost him something real, something that no amount of professional recognition could compensate for. Larry Linville left with integrity, recognizing his own limits and respecting the show enough not to overstay his usefulness. David Ogden Stiers left, at the end, and properly, with grace and completeness. What unites these stories is not ego or pettiness or professional greed, though those elements appear occasionally at the edges. What unites them is something more recognizable. People making difficult decisions under complex circumstances, trying to balance professional ambitions against personal needs, trying to understand what they owed to a project that had given them so much and what they owed to themselves. MASH endured all of these changes not just intact but often strengthened by them. Each departure forced the writers to think differently, to find new sources of conflict and humor and pathos, to resist the comfort of repetition. The show that aired its finale in February 1983, drawing over 106 million viewers, a record that stood for nearly 3 decades, was a fundamentally different creation from the one that had premiered in 1972. It had been reshaped by everything it had survived, including the loss of people it could not replace. That is, in its own way, a very MASH-like story. The show was about a group of people doing extraordinary work under impossible conditions, holding themselves together through humor and loyalty and the stubborn refusal to be broken by circumstances larger than themselves. And in the history of its casting changes, its departures and arrivals and reinventions, it lived that story off camera as faithfully as it told it on screen. MASH was never just a television program. It was an argument about war, about humanity, about the stories we tell to survive the things we cannot change. The people who made it possible, the actors who brought its characters to life over 11 remarkable seasons, each contributed something essential to that argument. And when they left, for whatever reasons and in whatever circumstances, they left marks that shaped everything that came after. The real reasons why these actors left MASH are not simple, and they are not scandalous. They are human. They are complicated and understandable, and, in many cases, deeply sympathetic. They remind us that behind every character we love, there's a person navigating a life, with ambitions, vulnerabilities, fears, and desires that exist entirely outside the frame of what we see on screen. MASH asked us, for 11 years, to sit with that complexity, to resist easy answers and cheap comfort, to understand that the people who carry us through the hard things are themselves sometimes overwhelmed by the weight. It was good advice when it came from a fictional Korean War surgical unit in 1972. It remains good advice now.